Hi, my name is Mark. I'm a respiratory therapy student, and I'm here to explain to you full ventilatory support. Full ventilatory support is actually when you put a patient on a ventilator and the ventilator takes over the work of breathing for the patient. Usually that means the ventilator will actually provide the patient with a minute ventilation, a preset FiO2, and a preset tidal volume. We usually do this with the goal in mind to actually first stabilize and eventually normalize the patient's ABGs. We actually consider several things before putting the patient on full ventilatory support, and that is usually has to do with the patient's tidal volume, which we get through their gender and height, and eventually through their gender and height we'll get their ideal body weight. The flow rate, which is basically the rate in which gas flows from the ventilator to the patient. The respiratory rate, or in the terms of a ventilator, it would be known as frequency, which would be pretty much the amount of breaths per minute that we deliver to the patient, and also eventually the IE ratio, which we would actually rather we would rather actually have a longer E time than I time, due to the fact that with a longer E time we're able to actually give a greater renal return, more, and therefore increase the patient's cardiac output. So the first thing that we consider is the tidal volume. Tidal volume, again, like I said, we get it from the patient's gender and height, and therefore getting their ideal body weight. We actually usually multiply it between um, between 6 to 8 milliliters. First, we convert the ideal body weight into kilograms, and then we multiply it to 6 to 8 milliliters to get a unit of milliliters per kilo. Usually when we multiply 6 milliliters, that usually be like the minimum tidal volume. The maximum tidal volume will be around 8, and then we usually multiply by 7 to sort of get the middle tidal volume. Then we would consider the flow rate once we get the tidal volume, because usually the flow rate is the tidal volume divided by the I time multiplied by 60, and the unit for that would be liters per minute. Then we would actually go for the respiratory rate, aka the frequency, because in the ventilator it's not known as respiratory rate, it's known as frequency, and usually the frequency we would set it between 14 to 6 breaths per minute. That's the unit, like breaths per minute. And then we would actually eventually consider the IE ratio, which I have mentioned before. We have certain parameters in which we can manipulate the IE ratio. We can actually manipulate the E time with the frequency, and we can also manipulate the I time and E time with the tidal volume. But the number one thing that most respiratory therapists ought to look at is actually the flow. So when you increase the flow, you actually increase the E time, but when you decrease the flow, you increase the I time. And remember, the IE ratio usually is an indirect relationship. So when I time increases, E time decreases, and vice versa. So when you increase the flow, you increase the E time, therefore you decrease the I time, and of course, vice versa. If you decrease the flow, you increase the I time, but you also decrease the E time. And if you decrease E time, remember, you also decrease the venal return, therefore decreasing the patient's cardiac output. So outside of those, I mean, that's pretty much, I covered the basis of full ventilatory support. I hope this video was helpful. Thanks for watching.